Hello world, my name is Dakota, and these are my design journals. In this video, I'll be talking through the design decisions of a small prototype I built using Media Molecule's Dreams. I will discuss the choices I made and the reasons behind those choices. A quick thank you to Media Molecule for providing such an accessible and awesome toolset. You've no doubt inspired countless creators. Space Encounters is a Space Invaders-like shoot-'em-up. The focus of this project was encounter design, so I sought out to make several unique special enemies that challenge the player on separate axes. I have the most fun when I'm designing in the space between mechanical and thematic, so for this space game, I chose to draw on fantasy tropes for my enemies. I thought it would be cool to see these concepts expressed in a low-res, sci-fi setting. The basic enemy in my game is a simple invader guy. It moves predictably in a back and forth pattern and shoots in a regular interval. The basic enemies are meant to be trivially easy to defeat. The only purpose they serve is to split the player's focus, introducing an element of priority management gameplay for the player. The Brute is inspired by classic warrior fantasy tropes. The Brute is resilient and aggressive. When it patrols across the screen, it keeps a force field up that prevents the player from damaging it. If the player tries, the force field uses audio and visual cues to let the player know it isn't taking any damage. Occasionally, the Brute will dive down into close range, drop its shield, and power up a large conal attack. This window is the player's only opportunity to damage and destroy the Brute. The Brute asks the player to be able to dance with it and to be able to time attacks correctly. The Archer is inspired by classic ranged bowman fantasy tropes. The Archer is quick, moving from point to point like a hummingbird. It charges an attack that fixates on the player. Upon finishing its charge, the target location is locked into place and the payload is fired. The Archer asks the player to move constantly. If the player stands still, they will be quickly defeated by the Archer's tracking shot. The Cultists are inspired by classic summoner fantasy tropes. They descend into the level in a formation. When they arrive at their fixed location, they begin focusing power to open a dimensional rift in space. If allowed to complete their ritual, they release a very large explosion that occupies a majority of the screen, destroying all the cultists in the process. The Cultist asks that the player is able to unleash a lot of damage in a short window of time. It also introduces a question to the player. Can I afford the time to clear up this cult group? If not, I need to avoid one half of the screen until the cultists blow up. Each enemy's design not only works in isolation, but also in tandem with the others. Really fun stuff starts to happen when you combine these three special enemies. It's a lot harder to destroy a cult quickly with an archer forcing you to move constantly. Cults become harder to juggle when a brute's shield is down and you gotta damage it while it's vulnerable. Archers and brutes together cause a lot of the screen space to be occupied with one threat or another. With so many visual effects fighting for the player's attention, it was important that I called out certain things to the player. For instance, when you damage an enemy, no matter which type of enemy, the enemy flashes once, a common sound is played, and the player bullet animates in a tiny explosive ring. These small reinforcements, called celebrations, establish a consistent sensory language helpful for communicating to the player during visually busy moments. The final encounter is a large boss. Like my smaller enemies, the boss was inspired by fantasy tropes, in this case, a dragon. It has several attacks intended to challenge the player in different ways, and combines these attacks in a few different patterns. The dragon's main attack, Fire Bolts, peppers the playspace with projectiles, serving as a bullet hell-like challenge. The player must continuously navigate the bullet spray in order to maintain effective damage against the boss. The dragon's second attack is Focus Beams. The dragon charges and releases two parallel beams that extend from the boss down through the playable space. The player can dodge outside of the effective zone of the attack, but doing so means they won't be able to damage the boss during this mode. If the player chooses to stay within the beams, they can get damage in, but must dance with the beams in order to avoid being killed. The dragon's third attack is Molten Breath. The boss telegraphs this attack via the three sets of vents on its back. Once charged, it releases a large conal attack. This is also reminiscent of the Brute's attack. This attack is a mandatory downtime for the player. There is no effective way to maintain damage while the boss uses this attack. The player must avoid the space in front of the boss in order to avoid being caught. The boss's final attack is Boulder Toss. The boss releases large projectiles that detonate after a few seconds of travel, dealing damage in a large radius. These projectiles are not randomly targeted, they are aimed roughly at the player's location, so avoiding them is difficult. These projectiles are damageable. The player can shoot and destroy them before they detonate, granting the player another means of counterplay against this attack. When the player damages the boss down to 20%, a transition animation is played and the boss powers back up, glowing and attacking even more frantically than before. It fires its firebolts and boulder tosses more frequently, and also continues tossing boulders during the focus beams and phase breath attacks. If the player can manage to get through this final phase, the boss is defeated and the player has completed the level. I learned a ton while making this prototype, but here are my key takeaways. Enemy attack cues and readability are key to giving the player enough information to engage enemies strategically. The charge-up attack on the Brute may be too small to spot in the chaos of a real playthrough. Creating interesting encounters means providing the player ways to counterplay. In this simple shooter, I didn't have a lot of options here. The player can only move and shoot. However, you can see how something as simple as giving the player a lateral dodge would open up new design space. Now, I can have an enemy that attacks so quickly that it requires a well-timed barrel roll. For this prototype, I experimented with semi-random enemy spawning patterns. There can never be more than 2 special enemies on screen at once, and the game tries to avoid spawning the same special twice in a row. For the most pure shoot-'em-up experience though, I think hand-authored encounters would be better, as some combinations of enemies are way more challenging than others. And that's it. Those are my thoughts on my Space Encounters prototype. If you're a developer on Dreams and you want to help me move this prototype from block out to a full experience, let me know. My PSN handle is in the description below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.